Okay, I'm going to continue in Unit 3 discussing the different I/O management concepts. And so we've been working predominantly with the Java.io, but we've looked at a couple classes from Java.nio. So previously, we talked about the file class and being able to create a file and to read the contents of a file. And so I wanted to create just a quick video that showed all the different approaches we learned with how to write a file so that we have one place to see the various ways we can do that. And so a quick overview is a quick introduction to this presentation. We'll talk about writing to a file using FileWriter. We'll talk about writing to a file using the writeString method. We'll talk about writing to a file using a BufferedWriter class. And we'll talk about writing to a file using the FileOutputStream. So most of these we've actually covered in other lectures, but this kind of groups all of the different ways that we've written to a file together. To talk more about file processing, this is more file processing themed as opposed to an input stream or an output stream lecture. So a quick introduction. In this lecture, we'll learn how to write a file in Java. We need to read and write files in many applications. So Java programming supports both reading and writing text as binary, or we could do it as text as well. That's what we're really going to cover in this lecture here, because other lectures will cover how we can write objects or other binary data to files. So really the big mechanisms we'll look at is using the FileWriter class, using the writeString method, using the BufferedWriter class, and using the FileOutputStream class. And I think from these 4 different approaches we'll look at in this video, we've seen 3 of these already across the other lectures that we've had. So let's look at the first, write file in Java using the FileWriter class. So the most basic way to write a file in Java is using the FileWriter class, right, in java.io. That's what it was designed for. That's an output stream that writes data as characters to a text file using the default character encoding and using the default buffer size. And so it's useful when we want to write text to a specific file, or if we want to append text to a file, because remember, we do have the option to append and not destructively overwrite a file, or if we want to copy text from one file to another. So the FileWriter class is a subclass of the output stream writer, but we care more about it's designed for accessing files as the mechanism to what we're writing to. So write to a file using the FileWriter class follows effectively a couple steps. The first is we create an object, a FileWriter class associated with the text file we want to write to. We use the write method to write into a file inherited from the write class. Then we close the file when we're done writing. And then afterwards, we'll have some kind of message that we display as it being successful. So let's go ahead and look at our sample code for this. I'm going to jump into IntelliJ. This is going to be our first example. We open this here, and we're going to write to this file here. So I could delete it, but I'm just going to destructively overwrite it anyway. But if we want to see here, let's go ahead and delete this. I'll delete to prove that it's not there. Yeah, do that refactor. Okay, it's not there. So quick examination of this code. We're going to import FileWriter since it doesn't need any other writer. This is like the most basic writer we have available for writing to a file, right? So that's the only class we need. We'll import IO exception because we potentially can throw that. We'll create our kind of tester class or example class that has a main method, so we can actually test this out. Our main method is going to throw an IO exception, so we don't have to put everything in try catch block. Here, I'm going to invoke the constructor for FileWriter. One of the parameters is that we can pass in a file name. So that file name is the full file path or a relative path of the file we want to write. So inside of this, inside the current directory is an src directory, source directory. Inside there, I'm going to create this new file, writefile1.txt. Then now that I have a FileWriter stream open, I will call the write method to write this first string, welcome to CSCI. Then I'll write the second string, I love Java programming. Then I'm going to close my stream. Super important you close your streams. Otherwise, I'm not going to get a file with anything. And finally, I'm going to just print to the display I've successfully written. So let's go ahead, run this, and we'll see that all of a sudden here, we got the write file 1.txt successfully written there. If I open up a new file, I see the contents, welcome to CSCI. I love Java programming. So this is the just a simple way using the FileWriter method to be able to write text to a file. Now, the problematic thing about this particular approach is that every time we call that write, right, we're actually writing directly to the file each time we do that method. So it's not as efficient as some of the other approaches. Yeah, and so here, and the other big thing to be aware of is when we call this write method, if we include two lines back to back, and if we don't embed that new line character, so here we put a new line character. If we don't do that, if we remove that, it would set the next string immediately after this one. So any kind of formatting, tab, spaces, or new lines you have to manually put in when you do your writing to the file. Okay, let's look at another example. Let's look at using the FileWriter along with the scanner class, where we will prompt the user to write some text into the file from the user. So the user will supply text, and then we'll use that text as input into our text document. So this is our source code for that, but let me jump into IntelliJ, close out this other example we just did. I'm going to open up, let's delete this. We'll make sure this doesn't exist. Not that I have to do that because we'll destructively overwrite it anyway, but here you can see it does not exist. Guaranteed we will make it. Okay, so inside of write file tester 2, I'm going to import the FileWriter class. I'm going to import IO exception, and I'm going to import the scanner. I'm going to create an example class here so we can have a main method. Our main method is going to throw the IO exception, so we don't need a try catch block. We're going to create a new FileWriter that's going to use the file name of writefile2.txt. Going to create a scanner instance that's going to look at system.in. So that's going to grab any input, the input streams attached to the keyboard then. And we're going to have a scanner so we can evaluate the keyboard. We're going to prompt the user, hey, write your content. We're going to then use scanner to get the next line that comes from the keyboard input stream. And we're going to save that as a string. And so next line pulls everything until a new line character, which is the enter key on a keyboard. Then we will write that content, that string that gets returned to our FileWriter output stream and then we will close that, and then we will say we successfully have written. So let's go ahead and run that and write the contents. I can say, hello world, this is a message. And then I'm going to hit the enter, which is the new line, which causes next line to actually capture that string. And so now if I actually go to write file to txt, I can see hello world, this is a message. Excellent. Okay, so let's talk about writing a file in Java using the writeString method. So Java 11 introduced the writeString method in the files class. And so the writeString method writes a sequence of characters such as string and string builder to a text file. So the general syntax of this method looks like this. WriteString, we pass in a path as the first parameter. We can pass in a character sequence as a second parameter. We can pass in the char set as the third parameter, and we can pass in any number of open options as the set of parameters thereafter. And so just to specify, so this method returns nothing. It can take 4 parameters. They are path, which is the file path of the data type path. It's going to be the character sequence, is the sequence of characters as a string, which we will enter into a file. CS, the character set, is a UTF-8 character set used to write to the contents to the file, and the options are the parameters provides different options to enter the string in the file, such as append the string to a file or overwrite anything or whatever else, like however we want to do the writing. So just a special note that writing a text file using this method, the first two parameters are mandatory. So path and the car sequence, right? So the car sequence is the thing we want to write, and then the path is where we want to write it to. This car set could be a default character set, and we don't have to toggle any of these options, like whether we want to append or not. Okay, so the writeString method can throw potentially up to 4 different exceptions: an illegal argument exception, an IO exception, an unsupported operation exception, and a security exception. So it's better to use when the file content is short, clearly. And still, it's good to know that this is a thing, although I wouldn't say that this is one of the easier ways to write to a file, but know that it is a way you can do it. So let's take a look at the code here. And in fact, I'll go here. This will be our write file. Here we go. So I'm going to delete. Well, it doesn't matter. We'll overwrite it anyway, but I'm going to delete. Oops. Can delete write file 3. Let's delete it. We'll be explicitly destructive. We'll do that refactor. That way we know there's no write file 3. We go from 2 to 4. So let's open up our source code here. I'm going to import my IO exception. I'm going to import both my files and path class from the file package from java.nio. Here, I'm going to create my class, my tester class. I'm going to create a main method that throws an IO exception, so I don't have to manage any of that. So here I'm going to create a string, hello world, new line, happy learning. So that's what we want to write to a file. Here, I'm going to get the path instance of this file path. So this is something that does not exist yet, but we can create a path in our file system for it, and then we can go ahead and write it. So that's going to create a path, and so we'll call that file name. So then inside of files, we can call the writeString method, and we're just going to use those 2 parameters, where the first parameter is the path that we want to write to. So it's a path instance. And so where we give a file name to where we want to write to. If this existed, it would be destructive. If it doesn't exist, it's going to create it for us. Right now, it does not exist. And then the text is going to be that character sequence, which could be a string, and that we want to write to the file. And then to prove that I wrote that to a file, I mean, we're going to open up and see, but recall that files also has a readString method where we can give it a path. So we'll use file name as that path again, and we're going to get back the file contents as a string, and then we're going to print that out to the console. So if I go ahead and run this, you'll see that here, hello world, happy learning, and it's reading that right here from write file 3, which was generated by that call. So another way that we can write to a file using Java is with the BufferedWriter class. So the BufferedWriter class is also a character output stream. We always know if it's ends in reader or writer, that's based off of a character stream and not a byte stream. And so the advantage of this is that it buffers the stream of characters before writing them to the underlying output stream. And so the BufferedWriter class is useful for writing character strings and arrays. And it's better than just using FileWriter because it can read multiple characters at a time into memory. And then as we ask it to write to the actual file, it'll write to the buffer. And when the buffer fills up, then it does one write to write all those characters. So it's going to be more efficient, and it's going to increase performance by keeping everything stored in the buffer and then just doing one write, as opposed to a write per character you want to write, or per line or whatever. So the general idea of how we're going to write this program we'll just take a look. We've seen this before. This isn't novel. Let's just jump to the source code. So let's go to our example. Let's delete here the pre-existing. Okay, so there's, do that refactor. So there's no write file 4. This is the 4th example. I just deleted that. Let's look at the source code. So BufferedWriter requires an underlining output stream. So we'll also import FileWriter. And so what we'll do is we'll augment FileWriter to become a BufferedWriter. So we'll wrap a BufferedWriter around the FileWriter. So we're going to import those 2 classes, and then we're also going to import our IO exception. So here I'm going to create a basic class, a writeFileTester 4 class, 4th example we're looking at for writing to files. It's going to have a main method where we're going to throw that IO exception. So I can just have all these lines of code that try catch block. Here I'm going to create a new FileWriter. Then I'm going to pass in the file name. Write file 4 doesn't exist, so we're going to make it, right? We go 1, 2, 3, 5. We're going to create a new FileWriter output stream. It's going to save it as FW. Then I'm going to wrap around FW the BufferedWriter output stream, and then that's going to be the reference I use, and that's where I'm going to call my writes from. So here I'm going to write, this is an apple, and I'm going to put in a new line character, so I don't have to embed in my string, and then I'll put, this is an orange, and then I will flush the contents of my buffer so it actually writes, and then I will close my stream, and I'll print that the file has written successfully. I'm going to run this, and we can see the file has written successfully. And in fact, I know that for a fact because I see it now, write file4.txt, and when I open it up, this is an apple, this is an orange. Excellent. Okay, and the last example that I kind of just want to highlight on different ways that we can write a file using Java is using the FileOutputStream. And since this is an output stream and not a writer, we know that this operates as a byte stream and not as a character stream. So the FileOutputStream class in Java provides methods for writing data to a text file or to a file descriptor, and then it stores all of the contents or data as individual bytes. So it's a very byte-oriented stream. And so let's take a look at our source code here. Let's jump to our last example in IntelliJ. Write file tester 5. So here I'll import file not found exception. Here I'll import the file output stream. And here I'll go ahead and import my IO exception. Let's go ahead and delete write file 5. Well, just to illustrate that we are actually creating something when we execute this code. So now it just goes 1, 2, 3, 4. There's no write file 5. So here inside my main method, I'm going to do a try where the catch I'm going to attempt to do is if the file not found exception occurs. So here we're going to create the writefile5.txt path. We're going to create a new file output stream, file path here. We're going to create a string, welcome to Java. We're going to, from the string, convert it into an array of bytes. So just like we can take an array of bytes and convert it into a string, we can tell a string, hey, return your contents as a collection of bytes. We'll take the collection of bytes and write that into our output stream, which is a byte-oriented stream, and then we will close it and say that we have successfully written. And so notice we've successfully written, despite the fact that that file did not exist, we don't get a file not found exception on writes. We only get it on reads, because if it doesn't exist, it'll write it for us. So I just want to highlight that in this instance, we can import this exception, but this is an exception you want to try to catch for reading purposes. For writing purposes, generally, we just create a new file if it's not non-existent. And if it does exist, then we typically overwrite it. Okay, so let's take a look at the contents. Write file 5.txt, welcome to Java, which is exactly what we had here. Perfect. And so that's just an illustration that we don't necessarily have to use the writer classes, right? We can also use the byte or the character streams. We can also use the byte streams just as well just takes a little bit of processing of converting our string into the appropriate bytes to load into the output stream so that it gets translated the way we expect it to. And so, yeah, that's a couple different ways, 5 different ways that we could write text using Java to files, just kind of aggregating them all together. And so that's all I really want to say with this particular video, so that we have a collection of how to create files in Java, how to read files in Java, and how we can write files, at least text files in Java.